This is Dr. Eleanor Perfetto with the National Health Council. It's my pleasure to welcome you to one of our webinars on clinical outcome assessment. Today the webinar is on core outcome sets. What are they? I'm going to give a little bit of an overview before we introduce our speaker, Dr. Donna Messner. So just a quick overview of the National Health Council. We're a not-for-profit organization located in Washington, D.C., membership organization with the largest portion of our membership being patient advocacy organizations. And as you can see here, we have a wide range of advocacy organizations, large and small, chronic diseases, some of them very rare, some of them quite common. Our agenda today, we're going to review our objectives. We're going to have a discussion on why are we talking about core outcome sets today. And then Donna will present on a background on core sets and give us some examples. We'll have a Q&A session, and then we'll introduce August topics. So I don't want to steal Donna's thunder, but before I go through a quick overview of why we're talking about core outcome sets, I have to give you the definition. And she will certainly go into much more detail about this than I'm going to. So a core outcome set, what is it? It's an agreed upon standardized set of outcomes that should be measured and reported as a minimum in clinical research in specific areas of health or healthcare. So it's a minimum set that we should be thinking about when we do a study on a particular illness. What goes into a core outcome set? Well, a wide variety of things go into core outcome sets, a wide range of outcomes. So it could be survival and mortality. It could be those physiological measures, including biomarkers. It can also be symptoms, function, and resource use. So clinical outcome sets, core outcome sets typically do include clinical outcome assessments. Let me go back. That in this webinar series, we have been talking about clinical outcome assessments, patient-reported outcomes, observer-reported outcomes, clinician-reported outcomes, and performance outcomes. So PROs, OBSROs, ClinROs, and PERFOs. And that language has probably become familiar to a number of you on the call. And they would certainly be an important part of a core outcome set. So why are we talking about them today? Well, it's of interest because the FDA has grown interest in core outcome sets. In fall of 2018, the FDA put out an announcement on standard core clinical outcome assessments and endpoints. This was a request for information to inform their planned work to promote the development of publicly available core outcome sets, clinical outcome assessment measures for specific disease indications. And the FDA at that time was looking for comments from the public about this initial work they were thinking about undertaking. Later, after that, in the spring of 2019, the FDA put out a new announcement, and that was on the development of standard core clinical outcome assessments and endpoints. And this was a request for proposals, and it was to actually identify organizations and teams that would actually create the core outcome sets for specific therapeutic areas. And the FDA, in that announcement, focused on certain areas of the gastrointestinal diseases, migraine, opioid-sparing drugs for acute pain, and schizophrenia, and it also left open the option of covering other disease areas, provided the group submitting provided a strong enough rationale for why that disease area needed to be addressed. And so you can see that this RFP that they put out addresses core outcome sets as part of clinical outcome assessment. Excuse me, it's very confusing to say both of these in the same sentence. It addresses clinical outcome assessments as part of core outcome sets. So just as it's appropriate in the development of clinical outcome assessments to have patient engagement, it also is there's also a requirement for meaningful patient engagement as part of core outcome sets. And that's why we wanted to introduce this topic to all of you today. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Donna Messner. She's the CEO and president of the Center for Medical Technology Policy, and this is one organization that is very well known for its work in developing core outcome sets. Donna, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Eleanor. This is Donna Messner, and I want to thank Eleanor and her team for the opportunity to speak with you today. And just by way of background, I'll mention that we have been doing this since before FDA expressed interest in it, but we're really gratified that FDA is really beginning to express more interest in this area, and we were one of the groups that submitted information when FDA asked for it. So yeah, next slide, please. So why do we do this? Ideally, in the research world, when a bunch of different research groups do studies to look at, say, an intervention for a particular condition, in a perfect world, they would all be designing their studies in a way that would give you kind of apples-to-apples comparisons between all the different studies so that you can put them all together and get a nice picture of, you know, which interventions are best for which patients. And you know, in the perfect world, you would be able to easily aggregate studies to get those answers and get a broad picture. But next slide, please. In the real world, it doesn't work that way. You have a lot of different outcome concepts that researchers want to explore, have a lot of different ways to measure the same concept that might not be easily aggregated. And so that leads to a lot of variability between clinical trials. And on the next slide, oftentimes what matters most to patients isn't necessarily the thing that gets studied at the time. There are lots of legitimate research-related reasons to choose a lot of different outcome concepts to study. Those may or may not be the things that are most important to patients or people who have to make care decisions. And so on the next slide, we like to use the example of consumer reports to illustrate why this is challenging for people who do systematic reviews and guidelines and providers who are trying to figure out what's best for their patients. If you think consumer reports, and I know I've been using consumer reports a lot lately because you know, we are in a new house and we've been buying new appliances and looking up information to try to figure out which appliance is best for our needs. Here you see listings for electric drills. If you want to buy a new electric drill, maybe you're more interested in the speed and power of the drill, or maybe you have to use it a lot on batteries, so you're more interested in how much runtime you're going to be able to get from that drill on the battery and how long it will take to recharge. Whatever concern is that you have, you know, whatever your priority is for choosing a drill, you're going to be able to look at this evaluation part that Consumer Reports provides and figure out what you need. Imagine that the information Consumer Reports looked like what's on the next slide, where half the information is missing. And the parameters for evaluation between different drills are different. So you might be able to see the power on one and the speed on another and the runtime on another, but you can't see the whole picture. You know, this makes it difficult for you to decide based on your values, what's most important to you, it makes it difficult to decide which one of these drills to get. And that's the kind of issue we have in clinical studies, where you could think of each of the drill brands as a different intervention, and each of the qualities of the drill is a different outcome concept that you want to evaluate. So this is why we do core outcome sets, because we're trying to get greater consistency across these clinical studies, so that decision makers can have a better view of the evidence to make decisions about what's appropriate for them. Next slide. So again, if you weren't totally listening the first time, here's the definition the second time. A core outcome set is an agreed standardized set of outcomes that should be measured and reported at a minimum in all clinical research for a given area of healthcare, given condition, and that word minimum is very important here. We're not trying to tell researchers everything that they should be studying when they're looking at an intervention, but we are trying to establish a consistent minimum group of that can be consistently accessible to decision makers. Next slide. And that of information then becomes accessible for decision making across all of these different contexts, where you have the market approval stage, the market access stage, where health plans are what their coverage policies are going to look like and how to reimburse. You have the actual care decision making, where patients and or caregivers and their providers are trying to figure out what's best. If we can have a baseline, consistent body of evidence available across all of these contexts, it will help facilitate all of these decisions. Next slide, please. So it's important to say there's the outcome concept, right, which is the basic what you want to measure. And then the how to measure it. And the how to measure encompasses the rest of things of, you know, what tool or instrument are going to use. Is it going to be a survey? Is there a test? You know, there's different ways to get this information. That the different information might be administered over a certain period of time. So if you have to administer the test, you know, if you think the example of a 6-minute walk test, well, if one group did a 6-minute walk test and another group did an 8-minute and another 12-minute, it wouldn't mean the same thing. So it has to be the same amount of time. It has to be the same amount of method of aggregation. Are you going to report it out as a mean, or as a proportion of patients, or as a median? You know, are you to measure from a parameter from baseline over a given period of time, like maybe look at time 0 and then a month out? These types of considerations that taken together a fully specified outcome assessment, and ultimately the outcome concept has to be linked with all of these measurement parameters and done consistently for those studies to be able to be aggregated consistently. And it makes sense to decision makers in a way that can be, again, sort of apples to apples comparisons. Next slide, please. So just briefly, the COMET is a group called the Clinical Outcomes Effectiveness Trials Initiative, and they've been very involved in helping to establish standardized methods for doing this and for They maintain a database of different groups that are working on core outcomes so that you can see who's working in what areas and have sort of a central resource. They've put out this basic stepwise framework for developing core outcomes, which involves defining scope. What's your disease areas? There are particular population or therapy that is relevant, for your scope. Make sure that there's a need there. And when we do these, we actually do it kind of the other way around. We start with, then figure out the scope that's appropriate for that need. Developing a protocol, deciding the concept, the what to measure, and then once you've worked out what's most important to measure, then you get into the specifics of how to measure. Next slide, please. So I'm going to give you a specific example of a project that we finished up the first phase of it last year and are moving into a second phase now. This was a core outcome set to measure the effectiveness and value of gene therapy in hemophilia. So what was the issue that we were trying to address there? And hemophilia, as I'm sure you all know, you have had basically the same standard of care for a long time, up to the point of therapy. You had a very difficult to maintain therapeutic regimen, and in terms of clinical outcome assessment, it was the same outcome concepts have been typically used in clinical trials for a very long time now. Things like frequency of bleeds, but with the advent of gene therapies, which can be for many patients something close to a cure, changes the standard of care, or has the potential to. It has the potential to change the way we do clinical trials for this condition. Because now if you have something like frequency of bleeds, if that goes to 0, is that a meaningful outcome in a clinical trial? Are you going to be able to compare different gene therapies on that basis? What other outcomes should we be thinking about as important to measure in this very different therapeutic context? So that was why we decided to do a core outcome set in this, because gene therapy was really changing the landscape. Next slide, please. So the way we do this is we engage not only patients, but also clinicians, payers, methods experts, and clinical experts. We get industry people who are developing the therapies involved, have people from the FDA, and we had on this the CDC as well. So we try to get all of the key stakeholders who should have a say in how we're doing this involved. But we have a particular approach that I'll describe to you for making sure that that patient voice comes through. Next slide, please. So our basic process goes like this. We do a background review and look at all the clinical studies that have been getting done and identify all of the outcome concepts that have been used in this area and summarize them all into a list. In this case, we had 48. And we go through a couple of rounds of survey to narrow down that list of outcomes, to sort of knock out the ones that are less important to define as core. So again, part of that minimal set that should always be measured. And then we go into a consensus meeting with that short list of candidates for the most important outcomes to measure as part of a core set. And the way we do it, and this isn't how every group does it, this is something that that was is our own way of doing this. In those first two rounds of survey, we have sort of safety net criteria going from round to round, so that if an outcome is important, an outcome concept is important to patients, then it gets passed through, even if it's not marked as important by other stakeholders. That way we can be sure that it gets passed through into that consensus meeting for discussion, and patients have an opportunity in that consensus meeting to explain why this is important to them. And then in that Delphi 3, we have a final round of voting where we drop the safety net criteria and do a straight vote after everybody's had an opportunity to hear from patients about what's important to them and why. So in this particular example that we're talking about now, the hemophilia, we started with 48 outcomes. In the first round, it went through 37. In the second round, it went to 9. Then after the consensus meeting, after the final vote, we ended up with 6. Next slide, please. And just to give you an example, what you're looking at here on this chart, we had a 1 scale that you see on the left vertical axis of importance, where 1 was not important and 9 was critically important. An average of 7, 8, or 9 would sit through to the next round as important to be retained. And what you see here, the different stakeholder groups that were involved are voting listed across the bottom. And you can see here that everyone, with just a couple of exceptions, ranked this very high in the 7 or 9 category. So frequency of bleeds as something that still needs to be measured was a high consensus outcome. Next slide, please. Whereas something like heart function, you can see, votes were all over the place. That's not to say that heart function is not important. That's one of the really critical things about doing these exercises. It's things that are certainly important to individual people, but is what's most important to include in all clinical trials for a given condition. It doesn't mean this would never be studied. It just means we're deciding on what should go into a core set. So this was an eliminated outcome. And then finally, on the next slide, this gives an example of an outcome that was retained because it was patient important. You can see that cluster with the red oval around it in the upper left. Those were the patients voting for this mental health outcome related to the transformational experience of having therapy. And the patients felt that this was an incredibly important thing to study. The rest of the group, as you can see, was scattered. And if it had been up to the rest of the group in the first 2 rounds, this would have been eliminated. But because that patient group that we included felt very strongly about this, it was brought through into the in-person meeting. Next slide, please. So again, Eleanor went over this, so I don't think I need to the dead horse, but we'll just reiterate that a clinical outcome assessment is something that tells you about how a patient feels or functions, and can be patient-reported, clinician-reported, observer-reported performance outcome measures. Next slide, please. So the core outcome set that we that we ended up with from the Hemophilia project included frequency of bleeds, and as I said, this, while it may go to something close to zero for gene therapies, it's still considered important because all of the previous clinical trials of other therapies were done with this, and so this becomes a legacy outcome for comparison to other types of therapies. So that's one reason that this was kept in here, but we also ended up with factor activity level, duration of expression, which is an important aspect of gene therapy, chronic pain, because as you know, joint deterioration is a problem with hemophilia, and then also healthcare utilization, which is a reflection of the fact that payers were involved in our process too. And in our in-person meeting, one of the points of discussion was that that it's important to be able to show, since these are very expensive therapies, it's important to be able to show that while you do spend more on the therapy, you're also saving potentially a lot on not having to hospitalize people and not having replacements and not having a lot of the other things that come with this condition. And then finally, I want to point out that emotional, mental functioning outcome that patients thought was so important. In the meeting, they convinced the rest of the group that this was indeed very important. And this, in the final vote, even though we dropped that safety net criterion for the final vote, the group included this in the core set because the patients convinced them that this was really important. And so what we're doing now is working with some other groups to develop a clinical outcome assessment for this outcome concept, because this has not. This isn't something off the shelf. It's something that needs to be developed. Next slide. Again, the goal of core outcome sets is to try to get more consistency across the way interventions are studied in clinical trials. Not to make every trial a clone of the next, or you won't be able to study new questions, but certainly to get a basic set of information that's consistent across trials so that we can make better selections across bodies of evidence and a better understanding of what's best for which patients at which times. Next.
Thanks, Donna. We appreciate the presentation and want to open it up for some questions now. Some questions have come in, so I'm going to jump in here and get the discussion started. Are core outcome sets only intended for clinical trials, or are they intended for studies that might also use real-world data?
Really, they can be used in any context, depending on how you set the scope. Conventionally, they have been used very often in clinical trials, but we're putting together a project right now in uterine fibroids that's designed to cover not only clinical trials, but also registries and observational studies, post-market studies. So you certainly use it for real-world evidence. Really the issue is just making sure that you have set a scope that makes sense, because what you're saying is that that always have to be studied across all of these kinds of studies. So you have to make sure that the way you define your scope, you're setting something that's going to make sense and is doable. But within that that set of or with that caution, you can certainly do observational, real world, however you want to define.
Great, thank you. Donna, we have some questions, and I'm going to try to group together because they come from the perspective of how might patient groups be able to lead or help contribute to this. So one of the questions is basically, is this something that patient groups could take on and could lead? And I know you've worked with a number of patient groups in the past, so if you would speak to that. Also, the question is, how long does it take? How much effort is this? To give a sense of what that looks like. And lastly, even if a patient couldn't take on leading it or doing it themselves, what kind of data might they collect that could contribute to something like this?
Okay. Let's start with, I think this is something that some patient groups certainly may want to tackle themselves. It just depends on, some groups I think are, better positioned maybe than others. For example, we are doing some work right now with the Parent Project for Muscular Dystrophy. They have their own registry. They are working with industry partners to, link up their registry to other data sources. And so they're very, very in the weeds of clinical evidence generation. And a group like that, I think, would certainly be able to go a long way towards setting up this kind of project if they were so inclined, although I do think it helps to partner with a group that has experience in the Delphi method and has experience in consensus methods and pulling in, how to work with different stakeholders, because if you want to do a multi-stakeholder exercise, it's hard to tap that whole network of different types of people that you need to involve, and they all speak different languages. So I think even if you have if you're in the weeds of the thinking about clinical data, there's still an advantage to trying to partner with a group like ours. But certainly, I think that's not to sort of exclude groups that aren't in the weeds of having their own registry and this type of thing. I think that that there are still ways that groups can think about working on this. But again, I really do think it's helpful to try to team with a group like ours that can do the multi-stakeholder exercises and reel in the different pieces, the moving pieces. On the question of how long, we do these. Most standards, we do them light speed. The initial consensus process on the what to measure, the outcome concepts, we about 9 months. Then the how to measure, it really depends on if it's just a matter of looking at a series of existing measures and figuring out which one needs to be declared the one that was used. That can be a process that only takes 6 months more if it's actually developing a new assessment than talking about a couple of years or more. So it really depends on the trajectory of the project. But what certainly what patient groups can do in terms of data or ways to do this, or ways to sort of move towards doing this, or more prepared to work with other groups to do this. Something like the FDA Voice of the Patient meetings, where you begin to host discussions to work through what's really most important to you as patients about the experience of your condition. What are those clinical outcome concepts that are most important to you to be evaluated in clinical studies? I could readily see patient groups doing either Voice of the Patient type meetings, or even patient preference type exercises to try to answer those questions for themselves, and that data would be invaluable as a starting point for these kinds of projects. Did I answer those, Eleanor?
I think you did, yeah, I think so. The next question that I was going to ask that's come in that's somewhat related to what you've been talking about in a general sense is, how have stakeholders been receptive toward core outcome sets? You know, what's been the reaction to many of the stakeholders? And I think there's a concern that might stakeholders be against a core outcome set if something that they think is important doesn't make it into the set?
Yeah, that that's something that we always. I mean, certainly it's a concern for us. We structure our because everybody is describe the goal. People are often very, very enthusiastic and very very happy to join in, and then it comes a question of trying to make sure that we manage the consensus process so that everybody feels that it was fair, and open, and transparent. And what we try to do is to make very clear up front. Sometimes it doesn't work because sometimes people don't listen, frankly. But everybody is signing on to a process. They're not signing up to a project in which they agree that that they'll only play nice if they get what they want. They're signing up to a process where they agree that if the process is fair, transparent, and they feel that they got an opportunity to have the voice heard, and feel that everything was above board, then they agree to at the end of the whole thing, they agree that even if their personal top favorite didn't make it into the list, we want them to still feel that what came out of the process is valuable and something that they're willing to submit to. We use the word consensus. What we're really talking about, we're not talking about 100% agreement. We're talking about a process that everyone agrees to participate in and abide by, and which can be, most people get that and embrace it, and most people, I think, feel at the end was a worthwhile process, and that they do feel that what comes out the other end is useful. Sometimes you can't please everybody.
Yeah, I was going to add that you made this point earlier, that just because something doesn't make it into the core set doesn't mean that someone can't also measure their favorite measure that they like, or that they
Right.
think that can be included on top of the core set. You can include many other things that you think might be important, but at least minimally include the core set.
Yeah, and it does require sort of a shift in thinking, and it's something we have to people of a lot as part of the process, because it's most important doesn't mean most important to you necessarily. We're going to the doctor about a personal issue. It doesn't necessarily mean you know, things that are important to you may not be the most important thing to measure in all clinical trials. And ultimately what we're trying to get to is what are those things that should be in all clinical trials. And we have to be parsimonious about that, because biostatistics, you know, of any, not just clinical trials, but any type of study that you do, whether it's a registry or whatever, the more outcomes you add, the more difficult it is to get to statistically valid results. And so, so we have to be really economical in specifying a core outcome set.
Donna, when you were speaking earlier about the contribution that a patient group might be able to make, even if they're not able to take something on like this in terms of their own patient-driven project, you mentioned the voice of the patient reports, and we have a question in where somebody was just wondering about how the hemophilia voice of the patient report was actually used in the work that you were doing on core heme.
Well, yeah, well, what happens is a lot of really valuable information is in those reports, but then it has to be operationalized, right? And so what we do is, when there's a voice of the patient report available, we look at that to understand what patients have identified as some of the most important issues to them. We can map that onto the background research, onto the outcomes that are actually being developed in clinical trials, and we can look and say, okay, these outcomes that are being studied in clinical trials, you know, which of these have patients are related to the things patients have identified as most important to them, and is everything that patients have identified as most important actually being studied in clinical trials? So that's the way we use the voice of the patient meeting. And in tandem with that literature review that we do, and then we also do key informant interviews with patients and clinical experts, it helps us to understand where there's overlap and disconnects in the clinical trials that have been done.
Donna, we have one last question that's come in. Clinical trials get done around the world. So how are core outcome sets made global so that they could be used for global trials?
It's an excellent question, and we, you know, we certainly are aware of that, and we do, you know, it takes time to do that, but we have a couple of different strategies for doing that. The first is when we do trials that involve industry therapeutics developers, we try, you know, those are all, or the big ones are all certainly global companies. We try to get as many of them involved as we can. If global companies are participating in adopting the course, then you know, that's obviously an important advance to sort of moving that around the world. And of course, we publish in peer-reviewed journals. We get out to conferences, you know, the big international conferences for these different disease areas, and try to talk with people about the work that we've been doing. So, you know, we do have strategies that we're using to get the word out. But, you know, you're certainly right that that it's a big world and that doesn't necessarily happen overnight. We just do the best we can with.
Donna, I lied. That wasn't the last question. Another one has popped. Another one popped in, and it's a really good question about there's a lot of evolution in what we know about illnesses and new measures and advancements and innovations. So how does a core outcome set stay updated, or when does it get refreshed?
That is an excellent question. Yeah, this is something that we worry about a lot because you're right. These disease areas do change. That doesn't necessarily mean a new course set every couple of years, but it does mean, for example, we just did a course set in non-alcoholic steatohepatitis. That's an area where biomarkers are in rapid flux, and that's not clinical outcome assessments, but because biomarkers are a little bit of a different animal. But they're trying to get a handle on the best ways to assess, especially the earlier stages of that disease, which are asymptomatic. And so what all of the participants have been telling us is, this was a useful exercise, but come back and talk to us again in a couple of years and see where we are with some of this development. And that actually, I didn't answer the question earlier about how big these exercises are, and this would be a good place to mention this. There are some academic groups around the world that are, the tendency has been for these exercises to get huger and huger, and there are groups that are putting together now, hundreds, of hundreds of people across multiple countries, and those exercises take years to do, and we've gone in the other direction and gone to a small voting panel, a panel that's maybe 60 people or something, because it does need, if you want to be responsive to changing areas of therapeutics and changing areas of disease understanding, you just can't take forever to do these exercises. And so I think it's a real advantage to being a little leaner and meaner and trying to get them done more quickly, and then having the ability to go back and reassess every couple of years and just say, okay, where are we now in this disease area? Talk to a few experts, or even reconvene the panel that we had initially. And if you have a smaller panel, it's much easier to do that than if you've involved hundreds of people. And say, okay, where are we now in this disease? Do we need to rethink any of these outcomes, or are we still good? And oftentimes the outcome set that you have will be fine, and will continue to be valid, but sometimes maybe you need to just adjust. And if you're using the group that we use and doing the exercises in a pretty timely fashion, then I think it's much more feasible to go back and just do a gut check every couple of years or something to make sure that it's still working for the stakeholders who are using it. So.
Great. Thank you, Donna. Thank you very much for being with us today. We really appreciate it. It's very interesting to hear more about core outcome sets, and I think it's one of those new terms that's been out there for a little while, and so thanks for helping to clarify what it is.
It's absolutely my pleasure, and thank you for the opportunity to chat. I appreciated all the questions. They were really great questions.
Thank you. Just want to point out that for the month of August, our COA webinar series is going to take the month off. We're going to pick up in September with John Powers from the NIH, from the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious He's going to talk to us about clinician-reported outcomes. We're still working out the exact date with John, but we'll get that out to you as soon as possible to get the save the date on your calendar. And then in October, we're going to have Dr. Stacy Hutchins from a group called Clinical Outcome Solutions, and she's going to talk about clinical outcome assessment measures, building new or adapting old, when you have old measures that are out there and you think you might be able to use them, but you want to know if you should be adapting those or if you should be starting from scratch. So she's going to talk to that point. We are also wanting to let you know that we're going to have a special webinar that's going to happen in August that won't be outcome assessment related, but might be of interest. And it's going to be about the Sentinel Engagement Partners Work Group and the work that they've been doing, just to be informative and let you know what's happening with Sentinel as an update. So please mark that on your calendar, and we'll get that date and time out to you as soon as possible. And also keep in mind that we are still looking for your ideas for additional webinars. So if there are other clinical outcome assessment topics that you would like to see covered, please send us an email and let us know what you would like for us to cover in the future, and we'll work on getting something on our calendar. Thank you very much, everyone. Appreciate you joining us. Have a great rest of your day.